Grouping and nesting can make your code a lot smaller and save you a lot of time. If you have duplicate styles in your style sheet, you can actually group them together. And this is what I mean. If we have my ID, which happens to be an ID, class blue, and just an element, let's say h1, and all three of them are the exact same, they'll all change the font color to blue, then we can simplify our code by grouping all the selectors together, separated by a comma, and then the declaration. So here's what I did. I added my ID with a comma, my class, then a comma, and then my element. So all three of them are now in the same line. They're all before the same declaration. The only thing that you absolutely need to do is you have to have a comma between each selector. Now you can use IDs, classes, as well as regular elements, but you don't have to use one of each. You can use 3 classes, you can use 100 classes, or just 2 classes. You can stick with IDs or elements. Really, the way you code your style sheet is the way you code your style sheet. I'm just showing you a more efficient way of doing so. And along the lines of efficiency, we also have nesting. Nesting is very different than grouping. Nesting is one of those times where it's important to know about the document object model, or the DOM, and with nesting we can target very specific elements, classes, and IDs, or a mix of all three. In the example below, we use the button element that's inside the div element, and neither of them will have a class or an ID. So if we look at our code, we have our style, div, button, so our page is going to select all the divs, and then it's going to select all the buttons that are inside the divs. So as you see with our HTML down here, we have a div, closed it, and a button. And this is how it displays. Now you notice that our button has no class, and it has no ID, right? That's because our div button nesting targets this button. So exactly how this works is you have a parent element, then your child element. If we wanted to go one step farther, we could go span, and just close that there. Now what this would do is it would only target our span. And that's because our span is inside the button, which is inside the div. First, look at our CSS. It's similar to grouping, where we use a list-like selector. We have our div and our button. And what this means is that the div is the parent element and the button is the child. So that anytime our HTML has a match for this exact family, it will style the most child element with your CSS declaration. So here's what I mean. Div would be your parent, button would be your child, and if there are any matches for a div with a button element inside of it, which there's a div with a button element inside of it, this style is going to target this child and this child only. So in this case, anytime we have a button element that lives inside any div element, our button will have no border, background color of black, and the color of red. Second, look at our HTML. We have no class or ID attributes. Our button element is plain, but the button element is still styled. And as explained earlier, this is because our button element is the child in our selector. Going back up here, div is our parent, button is our child, and this is where it's important to know the DOM, document object model, and our style will target the last selector that you mentioned. You can apply nesting to classes, IDs, and regular elements, or mix and match them all. Now here's a larger example. We have style, class green, which is a 1 pixel solid green border with 5 pixel padding. Unique ID, which is an ID, 1 pixel solid red border, 5 pixel padding. All of our divs are going to have a 1 pixel solid blue border, again with 5 pixel padding. And then in here we have our parent element, which is class green, our child node, which is unique ID, and then we have a grandchild, which is div. So any div that's inside unique ID, which is inside green, is going to have a bottom border of 2 pixels solid, that's CCC, and that's a lighter gray. Font size is going to be 14 pixels, and the font weight is going to be bold. For our HTML here, we have class, green, ID is unique ID, and then we have a div. No class or ID with the div, but the div will still be styled, and here's exactly how it shows up. So our div here, our font is bold, 14 pixel, and it has a bottom border of 2 pixels. It's solid, and it's a light gray. Now, when we nest selectors together, we need to make sure that we do not use commas, and this is the difference between grouping and nesting. Grouping, you do use commas. Nesting, do not use commas. If you use a comma, then every selector between the commas is going to have that styling. Whereas if you leave out the comma, then only the last element that you specify, and in this example would be the div, will have this styling. Now here's a way you can actually remember nesting. You have your parent, then you have your child element, your grandchild element, and then your property and value, so your declaration. This can go on and on as well. So you can have your grandchild, and then, you know, your super grandchild. That's not the actual term, I just made that up. And on and on and on. So hopefully this made sense. If there's any questions with this, definitely throw me a question and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. And if everything is groovy, well then let's move on.